Did you know that the Roman Empire is the largest empire in history? At its peak, it covered over 3 million square kilometers and had a population of over 1 billion people. It's no surprise that it took over 200 years for Rome to fall. But how did it fall? Well, it started with a small group of soldiers called the Praetorian Guard. They were responsible for protecting the emperor, but they ended up killing him and taking over the empire. They made one crucial mistake, though. They didn't realize that the people weren't happy with the emperor's rule. And so they took their anger out on the Praetorian Guard. You see, the Praetorian Guard had become too powerful and corrupt. They controlled the entire army and were basically untouchable. But the people were fed up with their abuse of power and their arrogance. And so they rose up and overthrew the Praetorian Guard, ending the Roman Empire as we know it. And that, my friends, is why the Roman Empire fell. Freedmen. Rome differed from Greek city-states in allowing freed slaves to become citizens. Any future children of a freedman were born free, with full rights of citizenship. After manumission, a slave who had belonged to a Roman citizen enjoyed active political freedom, libertas, including the right to vote. His former master became his patron, patronus. The two continued to have customary and legal obligations to each other. A freedman was not entitled to hold public office or the highest state priesthoods, but could play a priestly role. He could not marry a woman from a senatorial family, nor achieve legitimate senatorial rank himself. But during the early empire, freedmen held key positions in the government bureaucracy, so much so that Hadrian limited their participation by law. The rise of successful freedmen through political influence or wealth is a characteristic of early imperial society. The prosperity of a high-achieving group of freedmen is attested by inscriptions throughout the empire. Census rank. The Latin word ordo, plural ordines, is translated variously and inexactly into English as class, order, rank. One purpose of the Roman census was to determine the ordo to which an individual belonged. Two of the highest ordines in Rome were the senatorial and equestrian. Outside Rome, cities or colonies were led by decurions, also known as curiales, fragment of a sarcophagus depicting Gordian III and senators, 3rd century. Senator was not itself an elected office in ancient Rome. An individual gained admission to the Senate after he had been elected to and served at least one term as an executive magistrate. A senator also had to meet a minimum property requirement of 1 million sestertii. Not all men who qualified for the Ordo Senatorius chose to take a Senate seat, which required legal domicile at Rome. Emperors often filled vacancies in the 600-member body by appointment. A senator's son belonged to the Ordo Senatorius, but he had to qualify on his own merits for admission to the Senate. A senator could be removed for violating moral standards. In the time of Nero, senators were still primarily from Italy, with some from the Iberian Peninsula and southern France. Men from the Greek-speaking provinces of the east began to be added under Vespasian. The first senator from the easternmost province, Cappadocia, was admitted under Marcus Aurelius. By the Severan dynasty, Italians made up less than half the Senate. During the 3rd century, domicile at Rome became impractical, and inscriptions attest to senators who were active in politics and munificence in their homeland, patria. Senators were the traditional governing class who rose through the cursus honorum, the political career track, but equestrians often possessed greater wealth and political power. Membership in the equestrian order was based on property. In Rome's early days, equites or knights had been distinguished by their ability to serve as mounted warriors, but cavalry service was a separate function in the empire. A census valuation of 400,000 sesterces and 3 generations of free birth qualified a man as an equestrian. The census of 28 BC uncovered large numbers of men who qualified, and in 14 AD, 1,000 equestrians were registered at Cadiz and Padua alone. Equestrians rose through a military career track, tres militiae, to become highly placed prefects and procurators within the imperial administration. The rise of provincial men to the senatorial and equestrian orders is an aspect of social mobility in the early empire. Roman aristocracy was based on competition, and unlike later European nobility, a Roman family could not maintain its position merely through hereditary succession or having title to lands. Admission to the higher ordines brought distinction and privileges, but also responsibilities. In antiquity, a city depended on its leading citizens to fund public works, events, and services, munera. Maintaining one's rank required massive personal expenditures. Decurions were so vital for the functioning of cities that in the later empire, as the ranks of the town councils became depleted, those who had risen to the Senate were encouraged to return to their hometowns in an effort to sustain civic life. In the later empire, the dignitas, worth, esteem, that attended on senatorial or equestrian rank was refined further with titles such as vir illustris, illustrious man. The appellation clarissimus, Greek lamprotatos, was used to designate the dignitas of certain senators and their immediate family, including women. Grades of equestrian status proliferated. Senate of the Roman Empire. The Senate of the Roman Empire was a political institution in the ancient Roman Empire. After the fall of the Roman Republic, the constitutional balance of power shifted from the Roman Senate to the Roman Emperor. Beginning with the first emperor Augustus, the emperor and the Senate were technically two co-equal branches of government. In practice, however, the actual authority of the imperial Senate was negligible, as the emperor held the true power of the state. As such, membership in the Senate became sought after by individuals seeking prestige and social standing, rather than actual authority. During the reigns of the first emperors, legislative, judicial, and electoral powers were all transferred from the Roman assemblies to the Senate. However, since the control that the emperor held over the Senate was absolute, the Senate acted as a vehicle through which the emperor exercised his autocratic powers. Unequal justice. As the republican principle of citizens' equality under the law faded, the symbolic and social privileges of the upper classes led to an informal division of Roman society into those who had acquired greater honors, honestiores, and humbler folk, humiliores. In general, honestiores were the members of the three higher orders, along with certain military officers. The granting of universal citizenship in 212 seems to have increased the competitive urge among the upper classes to have their superiority affirmed, particularly within the justice system. Sentencing depended on the judgment of the presiding official as to the relative worth, dignitas, of the defendant. An honestior could pay a fine for a crime for which an humilior might receive a scourging. Execution, which was an infrequent legal penalty for free men under the Republic, could be quick and relatively painless for honestiores, while humiliores might suffer the kinds of torturous death previously reserved for slaves, such as crucifixion and condemnation to the beasts. In the early empire, those who converted to Christianity could lose their standing as honestiores, especially if they declined to fulfill religious responsibilities, and thus became subject to punishments that created the conditions of martyrdom. Government and military. The three major elements of the imperial state were the central government, the military, and the provincial government. The military established control of a territory through war, but after a city or people was brought under treaty, the mission turned to policing, protecting Roman citizens, agricultural fields, and religious sites. The Romans lacked sufficient manpower or resources to rule through force alone. Cooperation with local elites was necessary to maintain order, collect information, and extract revenue. The Romans often exploited internal political divisions. Communities with demonstrated loyalty to Rome retained their own laws, could collect their own taxes locally, and in exceptional cases were exempt from Roman taxation. Legal privileges and relative independence incentivized compliance. The Roman government was thus limited but efficient in its use of available resources. Central government. The imperial cult of ancient Rome identified emperors and some members of their families with divinely sanctioned authority, auctoritas. The rite of apotheosis, also called consecratio, signified the deceased emperor's deification. The dominance of the emperor was based on the consolidation of powers from several republican offices. The emperor made himself the central religious authority as Pontifex Maximus, and centralized the right to declare war, ratify treaties, and negotiate with foreign leaders. While these functions were clearly defined during the Principate, the emperor's powers over time became less constitutional and more monarchical, culminating in the dominate. The emperor was the ultimate authority in policy and decision-making, but in the early Principate, He was expected to be accessible and deal personally with official business and petitions. A bureaucracy formed around him only gradually. The Julio-Claudian emperors relied on an informal body of advisors that included not only senators and equestrians, but trusted slaves and freedmen. After Nero, the influence of the latter was regarded with suspicion, and the emperor's council, concilium, became subject to official appointment for greater transparency. Though the Senate took a lead in policy discussions until the end of the Antonine dynasty, equestrians played an increasingly important role in the concilium. The women of the emperor's family often intervened directly in his decisions. Access to the emperor might be gained at the daily reception, salutatio, a development of the traditional homage a client paid to his patron, public banquets hosted at the palace, and religious ceremonies. The common people who lacked this access could manifest their approval or displeasure as a group at games. By the 4th century, the Christian emperors became remote figureheads who issued general rulings, no longer responding to individual petitions. Although the Senate could do little short of assassination and open rebellion to contravene the will of the emperor, it retained its symbolic political centrality. The Senate legitimated the emperor's rule, and the emperor employed senators as legates, legati, generals, diplomats, and administrators. The practical source of an emperor's power and authority was the military. The legionaries were paid by the imperial treasury and swore an annual oath of loyalty to the emperor. Most emperors chose a successor, usually a close family member or adopted heir. The new emperor had to seek a swift acknowledgement of his status and authority to stabilize the political landscape. No emperor could hope to survive without the allegiance of the Praetorian Guard and the legions. To secure their loyalty, several emperors paid the donativum, a monetary reward. In theory, the Senate was entitled to choose the new emperor, but did so mindful of acclamation by the army or praetorians. Roman Emperor. The Roman emperor was the ruler and monarchical head of state of the Roman Empire, starting with the granting of the title Augustus to Octavian in 27 BC. The term emperor is a modern convention and did not exist as such during the empire. When a given Roman is described as becoming emperor in English, it generally reflects his accession as Augustus, and later as Basileus. Another title used was imperator, originally a military honorific, and Caesar, originally a cognomen. Early emperors also used the title princeps, first one, alongside other republican titles, notably consul and pontifex maximus. The legitimacy of an emperor's rule depended on his control of the Roman army and recognition by the Senate. An emperor would normally be proclaimed by his troops, or by the Senate, or both. The first emperors reigned alone. Later emperors would sometimes rule with co-emperors to secure the succession or to divide the administration of the empire between them. The office of emperor was thought to be distinct from that of a rex, king. Augustus, the first emperor, resolutely refused recognition as a monarch. For the first 300 years of Roman emperors, efforts were made to portray the emperors as leaders of the Republic, fearing any association with the kings who ruled Rome prior to the Republic. Military. After the Punic Wars, the Roman army comprised professional soldiers who volunteered for 20 years of active duty and 5 as reserves. The transition to a professional military began during the late Republic and was one of the many profound shifts away from republicanism under which an army of conscript citizens defended the homeland against a specific threat. The Romans expanded their war machine by organizing the communities that they conquered in Italy into a system that generated huge reservoirs of manpower for their army. By imperial times, military service was a full-time career. The pervasiveness of military garrisons throughout the empire was a major influence in the process of Romanization. The primary mission of the military of the early empire was to preserve the Pax Romana. The 3 major divisions of the military were the garrison at Rome, comprising the Praetorian Guard, the cohortes urbanae, and the vigiles, who functioned as police and firefighters, the provincial army, comprising the Roman legions and the auxiliaries provided by the provinces, auxilia, the navy. Relief panel from Trajan's column in Rome, showing the building of a fort and the reception of a Dacian embassy. Through his military reforms, which included consolidating or disbanding units of questionable loyalty, Augustus regularized the legion. A legion was organized into 10 cohorts, each of which comprised 6 centuries, with a century further made up of 10 squads, contubernia. The exact size of the imperial legion, which was likely determined by logistics, has been estimated to range from 4,800 to 5,280. After Germanic tribes wiped out 3 legions in the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD, the number of legions was increased from 25 to around 30. The army had about 300,000 soldiers in the 1st century, and under 400,000 in the 2nd, significantly smaller than the collective armed forces of the conquered territories. No more than 2% of adult males living in the empire served in the imperial army. Augustus also created the Praetorian Guard, 9 cohorts, ostensibly to maintain the public peace, which were garrisoned in Italy. Better paid than the legionaries, the Praetorians served only 16 years. The auxilia were recruited from among the non-citizens. Organized in smaller units of roughly cohort strength, they were paid less than the legionaries, and after 25 years of service were rewarded with Roman citizenship, also extended to their sons. According to Tacitus, there were roughly as many auxiliaries as there were legionaries, thus around 125,000 men, implying approximately 250 auxiliary regiments. The Roman cavalry of the earliest empire were primarily from Celtic, Hispanic, or Germanic areas. Several aspects of training and equipment derived from the Celts. The Roman navy not only aided in the supply and transport of the legions, but also in the protection of the frontiers along the rivers Rhine and Danube. Another duty was protecting maritime trade against pirates. It patrolled the Mediterranean, parts of the North Atlantic coasts, and the Black Sea. Nevertheless, the army was considered the senior and more prestigious branch. Provincial government. An annexed territory became a Roman province in 3 steps, making a register of cities, taking a census, and surveying the land. Further government record-keeping included births and deaths, real estate transactions, taxes, and juridical proceedings. In the 1st and 2nd centuries, the central government sent out around 160 officials annually to govern outside Italy. Among these officials were the Roman governors, magistrates elected at Rome who in the name of the Roman people governed senatorial provinces, or governors, usually of equestrian rank, who held their imperium on behalf of the emperor in imperial provinces, most notably Roman Egypt. A governor had to make himself accessible to the people he governed, but he could delegate various duties. His staff, however, was minimal, his official attendants, apparitores, including lictors, heralds, messengers, scribes, and bodyguards, legates, both civil and military, usually of equestrian rank, and friends who accompanied him unofficially. Other officials were appointed as supervisors of government finances. Separating fiscal responsibility from justice and administration was a reform of the imperial era to avoid provincial governors and tax farmers exploiting local populations for personal gain. Equestrian procurators, whose authority was originally extrajudicial and extra-constitutional, managed both state-owned property and the personal property of the emperor, res privata. Because Roman government officials were few, a provincial who needed help with a legal dispute or criminal case might seek out any Roman perceived to have some official capacity. In the High Empire, Italy was legally distinguished from the provinces, and along with some favored provincial communities, enjoyed immunity from the property tax and poll tax. However, under the Emperor Diocletian, Italy lost these privileges and was subdivided into provinces. Law. Roman law is the legal system of ancient Rome, including the legal developments spanning over 1,000 years of jurisprudence, from the 12 Tables, c. 449 BC, to the Corpus Juris Civilis, AD 529, ordered by Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian I. Roman law also denoted the legal system applied in most of Western Europe until the end of the 18th century. In Germany, Roman law practice remained in place longer under the Holy Roman Empire, 963-1806. Roman law thus served as a basis for legal practice throughout Western continental Europe, as well as in most former colonies of these European nations, including Latin America and also in Ethiopia. English and Anglo-American common law were influenced also by Roman law, notably in their Latinate legal glossary. Eastern Europe, was also influenced by the jurisprudence of the Corpus Juris Civilis, especially in countries such as medieval Romania, which created a new legal system comprising a mixture of Roman and local law. After the dissolution of the Western Roman Empire, the Roman law remained in effect in the Byzantine Empire. From the 7th century onward, the legal language in the East was Greek, with Eastern European law continuing to be influenced by Byzantine law. Roman courts held original jurisdiction over cases involving Roman citizens throughout the empire, but there were too few judicial functionaries to impose Roman law uniformly in the provinces. Most parts of the Eastern Empire already had well-established law codes and juridical procedures. Generally, it was Roman policy to respect the most regionis, regional tradition, or law of the land, and to regard local laws as a source of legal precedent and social stability. The compatibility of Roman and local law was thought to reflect an underlying ius gentium, the law of nations or international law regarded as common and customary. If provincial law conflicted with Roman law or custom, Roman courts heard appeals, and the emperor held final decision-making authority. In the West, law had been administered on a highly localized or tribal basis, and private property rights may have been a novelty of the Roman era, particularly among Celts. Roman law facilitated the acquisition of wealth by a pro-Roman elite. The extension of universal citizenship to all free inhabitants of the empire in 212 required the uniform application of Roman law, replacing local law codes that had applied to non-citizens. Diocletian's efforts to stabilize the empire after the crisis of the 3rd century included 2 major compilations of law in 4 years, the Codex Gregorianus and the Codex Hermogenianus, to guide provincial administrators in setting consistent legal standards. The pervasiveness of Roman law throughout Western Europe enormously influenced the Western legal tradition, reflected by continued use of Latin legal terminology in modern law. Taxation. Taxation under the empire amounted to about 5% of its gross product. The typical tax rate for individuals ranged from 2 to 5%. The tax code was bewildering in its complicated system of direct and indirect taxes, some paid in cash and some in kind. Taxes might be specific to a province or kinds of properties such as fisheries. They might be temporary. Tax collection was justified by the need to maintain the military, and taxpayers sometimes got a refund if the army captured a surplus of booty. In-kind taxes were accepted from less monetized areas, particularly those who could supply grain or goods to army camps. The primary source of direct tax revenue was individuals, who paid a poll tax and a tax on their land, construed as a tax on its produce or productive capacity. Tax obligations were determined by the census. Each head of household provided a head count of his household, as well as an accounting of his property. A major source of indirect tax revenue was the porteria, customs and tolls on trade, including among provinces. Towards the end of his reign, Augustus instituted a 4% tax on the sale of slaves, which Nero shifted from the purchaser to the dealers, who responded by raising their prices. An owner who manumitted a slave paid a freedom tax, calculated at 5% of value. An inheritance tax of 5% was assessed when Roman citizens above a certain net worth left property to anyone outside their immediate family. Revenues from the estate tax and from an auction tax went towards the veterans' pension fund, aerarium militari. Low taxes helped the Roman aristocracy increase their wealth, which equaled or exceeded the revenues of the central government. An emperor sometimes replenished his treasury by confiscating the estates of the super-rich, but in the later period, the resistance of the wealthy to paying taxes was one of the factors contributing to the collapse of the empire. Rome wasn't just an empire, it was the empire. From a myth of twin brothers raised by a wolf to ruling 3 continents and over 70 million people, the Roman Empire shaped the world we live in today. But how did it rise to such incredible power? And why did it collapse into ruins? In this video, we uncover the battles, betrayals, and brilliance that made Rome eternal and doomed it to fall. Prepare for a journey through ambition, glory, and downfall that will change the way you see history forever. For more videos of me getting drunk off of history and spilling the tea on all your favorite historical figures, stay tuned. The Roman Empire is one of history's greatest what-ifs. What if a civilization that started out so small could have conquered the entire Mediterranean and lasted for over 2,000 years? The Roman Empire is one of history's greatest what-ifs. What if a civilization that started out so small could have conquered the entire Mediterranean and lasted for over 2,000 years? He inherited a small kingdom from his father, but through a combination of military conquest and shrewd diplomacy, he was able to expand his territory to include all of Italy by 30 BC. Augustus also laid the foundations for the Pax Romana, a period of relative peace and prosperity that lasted for 2 centuries. This was the golden age of Rome, a time when the empire reached its greatest territorial extent and cultural influence. But it all came crashing down in the year 476 AD when the Germanic tribes invaded and sacked the city of Rome. The empire had become too big and too weak to defend itself against outside invaders, and so the Roman Empire fell, leaving behind a legacy that would influence Western civilization for centuries to come. So what can we learn from the rise and fall of the Roman Empire? Well, for one thing, never underestimate the power of a good leader. Augustus's military and diplomatic skills were instrumental in Rome's early success, but perhaps more importantly, he understood the value of peace. The Pax Romana was a time of unprecedented stability and prosperity, not just for Rome, but for the entire Mediterranean region. It was a golden age, but it didn't last. Rome's problems began when its leaders became too ambitious and the empire overextended itself. But despite its flaws, the Roman Empire remains one of the most fascinating civilizations in history. Roman economy. The study of the economies of the ancient city-state of Rome and its empire during the Republican and imperial periods remains highly speculative. There are no surviving records of business and government accounts, such as detailed reports of tax revenues, and few literary sources regarding economic activity. Instead, the study of this ancient economy is today mainly based on the surviving archaeological and literary evidence that allow researchers to form conjectures based on comparisons with other more recent pre-industrial economies. During the early centuries of the Roman Republic, it is conjectured that the economy was largely agrarian and centered on the trading of commodities such as grain and wine. Financial markets were established through such trade, and financial institutions, which extended credit for personal use and public infrastructure, were established primarily by interfamily wealth. In times of agricultural and cash shortages, Roman officials and moneyers tended to respond by coining money, which happened during the prolonged crisis of the First Punic War and created economic distortion and difficulties. The empire is best thought of as a network of regional economies based on a form of political capitalism in which the state regulated commerce to assure its own revenues. Economic growth, though not comparable to modern economies, was greater than that of most other societies prior to industrialization. Territorial conquests permitted a large-scale reorganization of land use that resulted in agricultural surplus and specialization, particularly in North Africa. Some cities were known for particular industries. The scale of urban building indicates a significant construction industry. Papyri preserves complex accounting methods that suggest elements of economic rationalism, and the empire was highly monetized. Although the means of communication and transport were limited in antiquity, transportation in the 1st and 2nd centuries expanded greatly, and trade routes connected regional economies. The supply contracts for the army drew on local suppliers near the base, castrum, throughout the province, and across provincial borders. Economic historians vary in their calculations of the gross domestic product during the Principate. In the sample years of 100 and 150 AD, estimates of per capita GDP range from 166 to 380 HS. The GDP per capita of Italy is estimated as 40 to 66% higher than in the rest of the empire, due to tax transfers from the provinces and the concentration of elite income. Economic dynamism resulted in social mobility. Although aristocratic values permeated traditional elite society, wealth requirements for rank indicate a strong tendency towards plutocracy. Prestige could be obtained through investing one's wealth in grand estates or townhouses, luxury items, public entertainments, funerary monuments, and religious dedications. Guilds, collegia, and corporations, corpora, provided support for individuals to succeed through networking. There can be little doubt that the lower classes of provincial towns of the Roman Empire enjoyed a high standard of living, not equal again in Western Europe until the 19th century. Households in the top 1.5% of income distribution captured about 20% of income. The vast majority produced more than half of the total income, but lived near subsistence. Currency and banking. The early empire was monetized to a near universal extent, using money as a way to express prices and debts. The sestertius, English sesterces, symbolized as HS, was the basic unit of reckoning value into the 4th century, though the silver denarius, worth 4 sesterces, was also used beginning in the Severan dynasty. The smallest coin commonly circulated was the bronze as 1/10 denarius. Bullion and ingots seem not to have counted as pecunia, money, and were used only on the frontiers. Romans in the 1st and 2nd centuries counted coins rather than weighing them, an indication that the coin was valued on its face. This tendency towards fiat money led to the debasement of Roman coinage in the later empire. The standardization of money throughout the empire promoted trade and market integration. The high amount of metal coinage in circulation increased the money supply for trading or saving. Rome had no central bank, and regulation of the banking system was minimal. Banks of classical antiquity typically kept less in reserves than the full total of customers' deposits. A typical bank had fairly limited capital, and often only one principal. Seneca assumes that anyone involved in Roman commerce needs access to credit. A professional deposit banker received and held deposits for a fixed or indefinite term and lent money to third parties. The senatorial elite were involved heavily in private lending, both as creditors and borrowers. The holder of a debt could use it as a means of payment by transferring it to another party without cash changing hands. Although it has sometimes been thought that ancient Rome lacked documentary transactions, the system of banks throughout. The empire permitted the exchange of large sums without physically transferring coins, in part because of the risks of moving large amounts of cash. Only one serious credit shortage is known to have occurred in the early empire in 33 AD. Generally, available capital exceeded the amount needed by borrowers. The central government itself did not borrow money, and without public debt had to fund deficits from cash reserves. Emperors of the Antonine and Severan dynasties debased the currency, particularly the denarius, under the pressures of meeting military payrolls. Sudden inflation under Commodus damaged the credit market. In the mid-200s, the supply of specie contracted sharply. Conditions during the crisis of the 3rd century, such as reductions in long-distance trade, disruption of mining operations, and the physical transfer of gold coinage outside the empire by invading enemies, greatly diminished the money supply and the banking sector. Although Roman coinage had long been fiat money or fiduciary currency, general economic anxieties came to a head under Aurelian, and bankers lost confidence in coins. Despite Diocletian's introduction of the gold solidus and monetary reforms, the credit market of the empire never recovered its former robustness. Mining and metallurgy. The main mining regions of the empire were the Iberian Peninsula, silver, copper, lead, iron, and gold. Gaul, gold, silver, iron. Britain, mainly iron, lead, tin. The Danubian provinces, gold, iron. Macedonia and Thrace, gold, silver. And Asia Minor, gold, silver, iron, tin. Intensive large-scale mining of alluvial deposits and by means of open-cast mining and underground mining took place from the reign of Augustus up to the early 3rd century, when the instability of the empire disrupted production. Hydraulic mining allowed base and precious metals to be extracted on a proto-industrial scale. The total annual iron output is estimated at 82,500 tons. Copper and lead production levels were unmatched until the Industrial Revolution. At its peak around the mid-2nd century, the Roman silver stock is estimated at $10,000 t, 5 to 10 times larger than the combined silver mass of medieval Europe and the Caliphate around 800 AD. As an indication of the scale of Roman metal production, lead pollution in the Greenland ice sheet quadrupled over prehistoric levels during the imperial era and dropped thereafter. Transportation and communication. The empire completely encircled the Mediterranean, which they called Our Sea, Mare Nostrum. Roman sailing vessels navigated the Mediterranean as well as major rivers. Transport by water was preferred where possible, as moving commodities by land was more difficult. Vehicles, wheels, and ships indicate the existence of a great number of skilled woodworkers. Land transport utilized the advanced system of Roman roads called viae. These roads were primarily built for military purposes, but also served commercial ends. The in-kind taxes paid by communities included the provision of personnel, animals, or vehicles for the cursus publicus, the state mail and transport service established by Augustus. Relay stations were located along the roads every 7 to 12 Roman miles and tended to grow into villages or trading posts. A mansio, plural mansiones, was a privately run service station franchised by the imperial bureaucracy for the cursus publicus. The distance between mansiones was determined by how far a wagon could travel in a day. Carts were usually pulled by mules, traveling about 4 mapalinatrins. Trade and commodities. Roman provinces traded among themselves, but trade extended outside the frontiers to regions as far away as China and India. Chinese trade was mostly conducted overland through middlemen along the Silk Road. Indian trade also occurred by sea from Egyptian ports. The main commodity was grain. Also traded were olive oil, foodstuffs, garum, fish sauce, slaves, ore, and manufactured metal objects, fibers and textiles, timber, pottery, glassware, marble, papyrus, spices and materia medica, ivory, pearls, and gemstones. Though most provinces could produce wine, regional varieties were desirable and wine was a central trade. Roman commerce was a major sector of the Roman economy during the later generations of the Republic and throughout most of the imperial period. Fashions and trends in historiography and in popular culture have tended to neglect the economic basis of the empire in favor of the lingua franca of Latin and the exploits of the Roman legions. The language and the legions were supported by trade and were part of its backbone. The Romans were businessmen, and the longevity of their empire was caused by their commercial trade. Whereas in theory, members of the Roman Senate and their sons were restricted when engaging in trade, the members of the equestrian order were involved in businesses despite their upper-class values, which laid the emphasis on military pursuits and leisure activities. Plebeians and freedmen held shop or manned stalls at markets, and vast numbers of slaves did most of the hard work. The slaves were themselves also the subject of commercial transactions. Probably because of their high proportion in society compared to that in classical Greece, the reality of runaways and the servile wars and minor uprisings, they gave a distinct flavor to Roman commerce. The intricate, complex, and extensive accounting of Roman trade was conducted with counting boards and the Roman abacus. The abacus, which used Roman numerals, was ideally suited to the counting of Roman currency and tallying of Roman measures. Labor and occupations. Inscriptions record 268 different occupations in Rome and 85 in Pompeii. Professional associations or trade guilds, collegia, are attested for a wide range of occupations, some quite specialized. Work performed by slaves falls into 5 general categories. Domestic, with epitaphs recording at least 55 different household jobs, imperial or public service, urban crafts and services, agriculture, and mining. Convicts provided much of the labor in the mines or quarries, where conditions were notoriously brutal. In practice, there was little division of labor between slave and free, and most workers were illiterate and without special skills. The greatest number of common laborers were employed in agriculture. In Italian industrial farming, latifundia, these may have been mostly slaves, but elsewhere slave farm labor was probably less important. Textile and clothing production was a major source of employment. Both textiles and finished garments were traded, and products were often named for peoples or towns, like a fashion label. Better ready-to-wear was exported by local businessmen, negotiatores or mercatores. Finished garments might be retailed by their sales agents, by vestiari, clothing dealers, or peddled by itinerant merchants. The fullers, fullones, and dye workers, coloratores, had their own guilds. Centenari were guild workers who specialized in textile production and the recycling of old clothes into pieces. Architecture and engineering. The chief Roman contributions to architecture were the arch, vault, and dome. Some Roman structures still stand today, due in part to sophisticated methods of making cements and concrete. Roman temples developed Etruscan and Greek forms, with some distinctive elements. Roman roads are considered the most advanced built until the early 19th century. Roman bridges were among the first large and lasting bridges, built from stone and in most cases concrete, with the arch as the basic structure. The largest Roman bridge was Trajan's Bridge over the lower Danube, constructed by Apollodorus of Damascus, which remained for over a millennium the longest bridge to have been built. The Romans built many dams and reservoirs for water collection, such as the Subiaco dams, 2 of which fed the Anio Novus, one of the largest aqueducts of Rome. The Pont du Gard aqueduct, which crosses the river Garden in southern France, is on UNESCO's list of World Heritage Sites. The Romans constructed numerous aqueducts. De Aqueductu, a treatise by Frontinus, who served as water commissioner, reflects the administrative importance placed on the water supply. Masonry channels carried water along a precise gradient, using gravity alone. It was then collected in tanks and fed through pipes to public fountains, baths, toilets, or industrial sites. The main aqueducts in Rome were the Aqua Claudia and the Aqua Marcia. The complex system built to supply Constantinople had its most distant supply drawn from over 120 kilometers away along a route of more than 336 kilometers. Roman aqueducts were built to remarkably fine tolerance and to a technological standard not equaled until modern times. The Romans also used aqueducts in their extensive mining operations across the empire.
Insulated glazing, or double glazing, was used in the construction of public baths. Elite housing in cooler climates might have hypocausts, a form of central heating. The Romans were the first culture to assemble all essential components of the much later steam engine: the crank and connecting rod system, hierosealopile, generating steam power, the cylinder and piston in metal force pumps, non-return valves in water pumps, and gearing in water mills and clocks. City and country. The city was viewed as fostering civilization by being properly designed, ordered, and adorned. Augustus undertook a vast building program in Rome, supported public displays of art that expressed imperial ideology, and reorganized the city into neighborhoods, vici, administered at the local level with police and firefighting services. A focus of Augustan monumental architecture was the Campus Martius, an open area outside the city center. The altar of Augustan Peace, Era Pacis Augusti, was located there, as was an obelisk imported from Egypt that formed the pointer, gnomon, of a horologium. With its public gardens, the campus was among the most attractive places in Rome to visit. City planning and urban lifestyles were influenced by the Greeks early on, and in the Eastern Empire, Roman rule shaped the development of cities that already had a strong Hellenistic character. Cities such as Athens, Aphrodisias, Ephesus, and Gerasa tailored city planning and architecture to imperial ideals, while expressing their individual identity and regional preeminence. In areas inhabited by Celtic-speaking peoples, Rome encouraged the development of urban centers with stone temples, forums, monumental fountains, and amphitheaters, often on or near the sites of pre-existing walled settlements known as oppida. Urbanization in Roman Africa expanded to Greek and Punic coastal cities. Aquae Sulis in Bath, England. Architectural features above the level of the pillar bases are a later reconstruction. The network of cities, coloniae, municipia, civitates, or in Greek terms polis, was a primary cohesive force during the Pax Romana. Romans of the 1st and 2nd centuries were encouraged to inculcate the habits of peacetime. As the classicist Clifford Ando noted, most of the cultural appurtenances popularly associated with imperial culture, public cult, and its games and civic banquets, competitions for artists, speakers, and athletes, as well as the funding of the great majority of public buildings and public display of art, were financed by private individuals, whose expenditures in this regard helped to justify their economic power and legal and provincial privileges. Public toilets, latrini, from Ostia Antica. In the city of Rome, most people lived in multi-story apartment buildings, insulae, that were often squalid fire traps. Public facilities, such as baths, thermae, toilets with running water, latrini, basins, or elaborate fountains, nymphia, delivering fresh water, and large-scale entertainments such as chariot races and gladiator combat, were aimed primarily at the common people. The public baths served hygienic, social, and cultural functions. Bathing was the focus of daily socializing. Roman baths were distinguished by a series of rooms that offered communal bathing in 3 temperatures, with amenities that might include an exercise room, sauna, exfoliation spa, ball court, or outdoor swimming pool. Baths had hypocaust heating. The floors were suspended over hot air channels. Public baths were part of urban culture throughout the provinces, but in the late 4th century, individual tubs began to replace communal bathing. Christians were advised to go to the baths only for hygiene. Rich families from Rome usually had 2 or more houses, a townhouse, domus, and at least one luxury home, villa, outside the city. The domus was a privately owned single-family house, and might be furnished with a private bath, balneum, but it was not a place to retreat from public life. Although some neighborhoods show a higher concentration of such houses, they were not segregated enclaves. The domus was meant to be visible and accessible. The atrium served as a reception hall in which the paterfamilias, head of household, met with clients every morning. It was a center of family religious rites, containing a shrine and images of family ancestors. The houses were located on busy public roads, and ground-level spaces were often rented out as shops to Bernie. In addition to a kitchen garden, window boxes might substitute in the insulae. Townhouses typically enclosed a peristyle garden. The villa, by contrast, was an escape from the city, and in literature represents a lifestyle that balances intellectual and artistic interests, odium, with an appreciation of nature and agriculture. Ideally, a villa commanded a view or vista, carefully framed by the architectural design. Augustus' program of urban renewal and the growth of Rome's population to as many as 1 million was accompanied by nostalgia for rural life. Poetry idealized the lives of farmers and shepherds. Interior decorating often featured painted gardens, fountains, landscapes, vegetative ornament, and animals, rendered accurately enough to be identified by species. On a more practical level, the central government took an active interest in supporting agriculture. Producing food was the priority of land use. Larger farms, latifundia, achieved an economy of scale that sustained urban life. Small farmers benefited from the development of local markets in towns and trade centers. Agricultural techniques such as crop rotation and selective breeding were disseminated throughout the empire, and new crops were introduced from one province to another. Bread stall, from a Pompeian wall painting. Maintaining an affordable food supply to the city of Rome had become a major political issue in the late Republic, when the state began to provide a grain dole, cura annoni, to citizens who registered for it, about 200,000 to 250,000 adult males in Rome. The dole cost at least 15% of state revenues, but improved living conditions among the lower classes and subsidized the rich by allowing workers to spend more of their earnings on the wine and olive oil produced on estates. The grain dole also had symbolic value. It affirmed the emperor's position as universal benefactor and the right of citizens to share in the fruits of conquest. The annona, public facilities, and spectacular entertainments mitigated the otherwise dreary living lower-class Romans and kept social unrest in check. The satirist Juvenal, however, saw bread and circuses, panem et circenses, as emblematic of the loss of republican political liberty. The public has long since cast off its cares. The people that once bestowed commands, consulships, legions, and all else, now meddle no more and longs eagerly for just two things: bread and circuses. Health and disease. Epidemics were common in the ancient world, and occasional pandemics in the empire killed millions. The Roman population was unhealthy. About 20%, a large percentage by ancient standards, lived in cities, Rome being the largest. The cities were at demographic sink. The death rate exceeded the birth rate, and constant immigration was necessary to maintain the population. Average lifespan is estimated at the mid-20s, and perhaps more than half of children died before reaching adulthood. Dense urban populations and poor sanitation contributed to disease. Land and sea connections facilitated and sped the transfer of infectious diseases across the empire's territories. The rich were not immune. Only 2 of Emperor Marcus Aurelius's 14 children are known to have reached adulthood. The importance of a good diet to health was recognized by medical writers such as Galen, 2nd century. Views on nutrition were influenced by beliefs like humoral theory. A good indicator of nutrition and disease burden is average height. The average Roman was shorter in stature than the population of pre-Roman Italian societies in medieval Europe. Food and dining. Food in ancient Rome reflects both the variety of foodstuffs available through the expanded trade networks of the Roman Empire and the traditions of conviviality from ancient Rome's earliest times, inherited in part from the Greeks and Etruscans. In contrast to the Greek symposium, which was primarily a drinking party, the equivalent social institution of the Roman convivium, dinner party, was focused on food. Banqueting played a major role in Rome's communal religion. Maintaining the food supply to the city of Rome had become a major political issue in the late Republic and continued to be one of the main ways the emperor expressed his relationship to the Roman people and established his role as a benefactor. Roman food vendors and farmers' markets sold meats, fish, cheeses, produce, olive oil and spices, and pubs, bars, inns and food stalls sold prepared food. Bread was an important part of the Roman diet, with more well-to-do people eating wheat bread and poorer people eating that made from barley. Fresh produce, such as vegetables and legumes, were important to Romans, as farming was a valued activity. A variety of olives and nuts were eaten. While there were prominent Romans who discouraged meat eating, a variety of meat products were prepared, including blood puddings, sausages, cured ham, and bacon. The milk of goats or sheep was thought superior to that of cows. Milk was used to make many types of cheese, as this was a way of storing and trading milk products. While olive oil was fundamental to Roman cooking, butter was viewed as an undesirable Gallic foodstuff. Sweet foods such as pastries typically used honey and wine must syrup as a sweetener. A variety of dried fruits, figs, dates, and plums, and fresh berries were also eaten. Salt, which in its pure form was a relatively expensive commodity in Rome, was the fundamental seasoning. The most common salty condiment was a fermented fish sauce known as garum. Locally available seasonings included garden herbs, cumin, coriander, and juniper berries. Imported spices included pepper, saffron, cinnamon, and fennel. While wine was an important beverage, Romans looked down on drinking to excess and drank their wine mixed with water. Drinking wine straight was viewed as a barbarian custom. The main Roman ingredients in dishes were wheat, wine, meat and fish, bread, and sauces and spices. The richer Romans had luxurious lives and sometimes hosted banquets or feasts.